Hello, I am Adam Forziati. I'm joined once again in another episode of Fragrantica Talks by Nicola Thomas. There are certain things that we would love to smell in fragrances after having smelled so many already that we haven't yet. And these are smells that we either love, hate, or find somewhere in between. But there are a number of times in my life where I've said to myself, if only they could capture this in scent. And I'm kind of curious to know a little bit more about what those things are for you, Nicola. I think we each had one to bring, so I'm curious to know, is there something that you have never smelled before that you would really like to smell in a fragrance but just haven't yet?
I mean, it's funny, isn't it? This is effectively going to be a Fragrantica Talks episode that's not about perfume. It's about smells rather than perfume. But yeah, I mean, there's three things that immediately sprang to mind when we started batting this idea around. And the first one's a really ubiquitous, well, reasonably ubiquitous smell. I mean, particularly amongst or for people who like to cook, which I do. And that's basil, fresh basil. Sorry, basil, if we're talking to an American audience.
Which you are in this case.
Basil. Yeah. And so I've never got close to it in a perfume. Never found anything that really captures that multifaceted green, unctuous, well, not unctuous, that's not the right word, moorishness, addictiveness. Get some fresh basil and crush it between your hands and you get the most gorgeous smell. I've only ever seen fragmentary representations of that in scent, apart from one time, the year before COVID, I was backpacking around Europe and I stopped off in Genoa. And apparently Genoa is really famous for its particular type of basil and the things that people make from it. And the town had its own, they'd like commissioned their own fragrance, which was centered around Genoan basil. And so there was these big reed diffusers on the street, and I was literally following my nose to try and find where this gorgeous smell was coming from. And eventually we found where you could buy it, but it was only as a room fragrance. And I was, the reed diffuser that it came in was really heavy and I had just a backpack. So I couldn't buy any, but it's haunted me because that was the closest I've ever come to smelling basil in a scent. And I just wish they had turned it into a skin scent. So, and maybe they did, and COVID got in the way and I was never able to go back, but it was fabulous. So yeah, I mean, have you ever smelled any good basil scent?
I can't really say that I have. I really wish I had, because sometimes I think that like the herbaceousness in scent in general just kind of takes over generally rather than specific herbs poking through. I think it takes a lot of effort to make, very specific herbs kind of, fly freely on the skin for a long period of time. It's a difficult art to do that. Yeah, I do think, though, that just a side note, that I think with enough Googling, you might be able to find the person who made that and maybe even commission them for a bit of it on to be put on skin. I don't know. That'd be really interesting to find. But now that you've said it, it kind of captured my curiosity too, because like you, I haven't really found many basil scents that I'm, totally in love with yet.
Yeah, yeah. So that's my first one that sprung to life for me is that. So if and as always, I love recommendations. So if anybody's got any recommendations for good basil scents, please do drop them in the comments. I believe there's a Hilde Soliani one that I do remember smelling, and I remember thinking that was quite good. I can't remember what it's called, so I shall try and look that up as we're talking. But yeah, so what's your first kind of thing that you'd like to recreate in scent that we haven't been able to yet?
Well, one quick thing to note though about basil really quick is that, just looking at its an analysis of the aroma chemicals that make up basil, the most prominent one by far is actually linalool, which apparently makes up about 50% of basil's smell. And anybody who's familiar with eau de cologne fragrances or fragrances that contain herbal notes in general or citrus notes in general, and certainly that's not where linalool's applications end, but would know the smell of linalool because it's a very highly used, chemical compound in scent. it's about 50% of basil's compound. And then there are other, I'm not going to bore everybody with the names of highly chemical sounding, naturally occurring compounds, but eugenol makes up about 5% of its structure. Cineol makes up about 8%. So things like this, where, these are spicy, but also a little bit, what's a specific type of spice? It's really like anisic. Basil is a very anise sort of centered spice. It has that kind of element to it that's really, I think, kind of steers it towards that Moorishness that you're talking about. But certainly that's, only a few out of a long list of things that make up basil's smell. So I'd be curious to explore that note a little bit further. And if anybody has any suggestions for that, I'd be very curious to sniff those as well. But I really only have one to bring today because it's something that's really fresh of mind for me. And I've certainly answered this question myself in my own mind, countless times already. Like, I really wish this was a scent, as I'm sure many of our viewers have before too. But one recent discovery in terms of scent that's in the ethers out there in the world, but not necessarily captured in scent that I know of, recently came back from my honeymoon. And on that honeymoon, we went to Ireland. And in Ireland, we did the most American who likes beer tourist attraction to ever be done, which is the Guinness factory or storehouse, if you will, tour. And the tour is great. I highly recommend anybody who likes or is even vaguely interested in beer to visit the Guinness storehouse tour if they're in Ireland. It's a really fun, well done attraction. But one thing that was really quite cool about it was, after the tour's over, we're outside the building. We're walking towards the hop on, hop off bus to get somewhere else in the city of Dublin. I smell this incredibly intoxicating, overwhelming scent outside the factory end of the complex there for Guinness. And it is, the best way to describe it is, wheaty and bready and barley-like and like very overwhelmingly pastoral and agrestic smelling. But it's also got some other things going on. There's a little bit of sweetness to the smell, but not much. A little bit of smoke to the smell, but not much. And almost like a saline quality. And the cool thing was that, while I was there in Ireland, it didn't really dawn upon me because, at that area of the city, it's not too far from a water source that has some salt in it, of course. And I thought that at the time it was just sort of a waterway breeze that was kind of incorporating with the smell of the Guinness factory. But the more I think about it now in hindsight, brewers, something that those who don't know much about beer, brewers often treat their water. It's not that, beer brewers are just tossing in distilled, safe to drink water into their, mash mixture and calling it a day. They're very specific about the quality of water that's going into their brews. And often that requires them to treat it with salt and create ratios of salt that are appropriate for the beer that they're making. Salt doesn't just taste like salt, it makes things chemically taste more like themselves. So it's a very useful thing to incorporate in your beer brewing. But something that I think about now is that I think the salty quality of the smell I was experiencing there was literally the salt they were adding to the beer in masse, right? I wasn't very far from one of the mash tanks where they, combine the different materials that ultimately create beer. So some combination of like weediness, saltiness, and a little bit of sweetness. And of course, maybe a little bit of a funk, like that kind of yeasty bread smell too. I've never really smelled that successfully translated into perfume. I can tell you that Noir Akume from Pierre Guillaume has this like salty, saline, funky quality that I was smelling in that mix, but it, that's where it ends. That's where the similarities end. And so I've always really wanted to smell like something like that. Even before I went on that tour, I've always been interested in the idea of a bready, weedy, agrestic note like that. A couple of the Slumber House scents do something kind of close to that. But again, I've never really smelled anything that really successfully captures it. Usually they're just very sweet, ethyl maltol kind of based concoctions that, though cool and interesting in their own right, don't really capture what I'm looking for. So I'm kind of curious if you've ever smelled anything in that wheelhouse.
The thing that sprang to mind was South by Mendittorosa. Not the whole perfume, I don't think, because it's got a soapiness and a clean linenness and also some red berries in there, I seem to think from memory. But there's a lovely bread accord in it. And the bread accord, it's meant to smell. I'm dredging through my memory for this, but I believe it's meant to smell like the comforts of home. It's like the founder of the brand going back to her childhood home and all those scents like washing drying on the line and a bread pudding perhaps that you get that kind of make you feel comforted. And the bread accord in it is definitely, well, I found it very much there, very noticeable, but very sophisticated still and very pleasing to wear. On a tester strip, I found it wasn't as noticeable as it was on skin. And there's something about it being warmed by your skin that then allowed it to lift. And yeah, there was just touches of yeastiness about it. And it's almost like you want to just extract that bread accord and amplify it somehow for what you're talking about. But yeah, it's very rarely done. And I agree, it's quite often cakey, I think you can find quite easily. Bready, perhaps less so.
Yeah, it's a challenging, I think it must be a really challenging note to convey in perfume, or at least maybe a note that perfumers didn't think for a long time would meet with success financially or, in the perfume community. I do think that many people would like to smell like bread. Not necessarily literally bread. In the smell that I was talking about from the Guinness factory was much, much more than just bread smell. It was, malts and sort of an agrestic kind of quality, and then that saline quality kind of balancing it out, and some smokiness and sweetness as well. So I do think there's a place in the market for something like that. But one thing I have to imagine is that, bread is a very complicated scent in terms of, the amount of naturally occurring aromachemical compounds that, is in freshly baked bread alone. That, again, that's only one part of the smell I'm after here. Numbers probably in the many hundreds. There are probably a number of pyrazines, a common material used to communicate breadiness, yeastiness, nuttiness, that are found in bread alone. So, I'd be really curious to know if this is an issue of maybe a lack of demand, or maybe an issue of it's just such a complicated accord that once you start throwing in other accords next to it, it loses focus. I had talked a little bit about Noir Akume from Pierre Guillaume a moment ago, and that was a scent I discovered as part of like an exploration of tea that I'm working on for Fragrantica right now. And what I found for that tea roundup is that, unlike a note like jasmine, where you can kind of successfully communicate jasmine either very simplistically or in a very complicated accord, you can either way, you can kind of communicate jasmineiness, right? Very, very simply. But with something like tea, I found that if there were too many other accords in the note pyramid, it started to lose focus no matter how brilliant that tea accord is. So, jasmine and rose and things like that, you can really portray it very easily no matter which level of complication you use. But in order to capture tea, or in this case, probably bread or bready-like notes, I think you probably have to use quite a few different materials to successfully pull it off. So yeah. I'm curious if that is really the culprit here as to why we don't see too many more perfumes that have that kind of quality.
Yeah, and I wonder as well if sometimes that yeastiness can go a bit funky, in a way that is perhaps, it sort of goes a bit sour, a bit cheesy, a bit unpleasant.
It could remind somebody of the unsavory aspects of a bar,
Yeah. So I wonder if that sort of association is difficult to overcome. Can smell a bit, because nobody wants to smell like a bar.
No, not really. That's definitely not the smell that I was so intoxicated by when I was passing by the Guinness factory. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, it's a really interesting one. And I'm interested to read your tea article because I'm a huge fan of tea scents. And I'll pick up with you after about some that you need to check out in case they aren't on your list.
Oh, I'm sure I'll get a lot of those comments. I'm looking forward to that greatly. Yeah, absolutely. So,
Yeah.
Nicola, that was my main bit, if you will. I'm curious to know if you had any other thoughts about fragrant scents that you've smelled, but you haven't smelled in scents yet, like in fragrances yet.
Yeah. So newspapers and newspaper print. Um, I think, so people have all these like amazing origin stories about how they got into perfume that were always like, oh, my mother used to wear Chanel No. 5 and I was intoxicated by it. No, for me, it was the smell of newspapers when I was a kid. There's something really interesting about the type of paper, the quality of the paper, which is, generally cheap paper, isn't it? And the inks that they use to print on the paper, that particularly when I was a kid, I could not get enough of. And obviously, decaying paper has that vanilla. It has chemicals in common with vanilla. So you get that sort of resinous, soothing, sweet sort of smell. But this is more than that. It's not just an old book smell. It's the ink layered on that and a sort of dustiness, a specific sort of pulpy paper that I find incredibly soothing, like incredibly soothing. And interestingly, I've mentioned before, I've got this synesthesia, this idiosyncratic synesthesia that only some stuff triggers. And I was once chatting to somebody about it, and they were like, well, could you smell that newspaper and it give you a colour? And any excuse to sniff a newspaper is good in my opinion. And I sort of picked it up and sniffed it, and I was like, yeah, it does. It's light blue. And I'd not tried that before. I'd not tried that sort of just picking it up and sniffing it and seeing what happened and sort of being in tune or open to that weird synaptic spark that goes on. And yeah, I find the smell of newspapers and newspaper print really, really pleasant and soothing. And I would love for somebody to translate it into a perfume. I think books have been done more successfully. There's a few things that I know that have got paper accords, like the Architects Club. Books. I think there's one by is it the Perfumers Library by Azzi, something like that. It's called something like Old Books, which is pretty good, really. It's got that sort of dusty old book smell, but there's something very specific about newspaper and newspaper print, and the ink on it has a very flat smell. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's a very flat, matte smell. On top of this pulpy paper. Oh yeah, I'd love that as a perfume. I think I might just give up at that point and stop smelling stuff. If somebody could make a newspaper and newspaper print perfume, I think that might be, something I bought 10 bottles of and then just retired.
That's so interesting that's your end of game.
Yeah.
Well, certainly I think somebody really should make that smell because the name possibilities sell themselves, especially if you read it in like a very like dramatic way. Imagine a perfume called Classified, right? Like or Correspondent or Masthead, things like this. That'd be very appropriate, I think.
Yeah, it would, yeah. Yeah, so that'd be a really cool one. I would very much like that. Yeah. And then the other sort of thing there's two more things that I've been thinking about. And I can understand why people don't make this into a perfume, but bear with me. So, because it's unsophisticated, it's not.
What on earth is this going to be?
The smell of dog or cat fur. I know it sounds, everybody's going, that sounds gross. Particularly people who don't have pets. But yeah, so this is the the kind of suspension of disbelief moment. The smell of it's warm. So Winnie, my dog, particularly, my cat's getting she's a little old lady now, and she's a little bit decrepit, and she's not so like up on her grooming as she once was. Don't worry, she's under the care of a vet and she's fine. But Winnie's much younger, and yeah, she smells warm and slightly honeyed, slightly hayish. When she's been outside, she has a green smell, a fresh air smell. And there's something really deeply comforting about it. At times she smells a little bit civete, or a little bit muscadia, like ever so slightly. It's not challenging. It's not, she doesn't smell fecal or anything like that. But she has all those lovely warm tones that, yeah, we're not talking about wet dog. We're not talking about overused dog bed where it gets funky and, again, a little bit cheesy perhaps. We're talking about warm, clean fur when, perhaps a few days after she's had a bath. And it's so cozy. And I imagine that if you could work that into a fragrance and you could make it sophisticated, this incredibly talented perfumer that we're all going to be commissioning to make all our, fantasy scents now, I think it'd be really appealing. I think like Animal Mondaine, Pierre Guillaume has a flavour of it a little bit, just a little flavour of it in that kind of very unchallenging, warm, animalic undertone that it has. And that's the closest I've perhaps come. I know there's Bengal Rouge by Papillon as well. I've only ever smelt a very small amount of that, and I think that's heading in the same lines, in the same direction as well.
It was definitely inspired by a pet, I believe. So it's good stuff.
Yeah, it is. But yeah, I think sort of, yeah, and I can see why people would pick cats over dogs because they are a little bit sort of sexier and sassier and easier to sell, aren't they? But I think, yeah, dog fur. So I'm going to be smelling of dog fur and newspaper print, if anybody's asking.
You had said Animal Mondaine from Pierre Guillaume. I would even venture so far as to say L'Ombre Fauve a little bit has a bit of that. I don't know how to describe it, but it's almost cosmetic or fur. Yeah, there's something about the skin or I don't know. It's just sort of an association I've formed with it. I don't know if it's really grounded in reality much, but I get a little bit of that. And as we've discussed before, L'Ombre Fauve from Pierre Guillaume and Animal Mondaine from Pierre Guillaume share some similarities. So,
yeah.
So what's your last one then?
Well, sorry, just on that last point, I think there's something sometimes tobacco-y that is along those lines somehow, weirdly, because my dog doesn't smoke or roll cigars or anything. Well, at least that I know of. Maybe she does. So yeah, but tobacco seems to be in that oeuvre somehow. It must have something in common. But yeah. So yeah, the other thing that I wanted to talk about was, and this is specific, this is really specific, Norwegian stave churches. So
I thought mine was specific.
Yeah. Winnie's decided to come and have a good itch on the floor as well. So she's clearly trying to spread her scent around the room. Norwegian stave churches. It's very specific. So obviously there are loads of scents that smell of churches. They tend to smell of stone churches, in my opinion and experience, a lot. There is something really delicious about the way that Norwegian stave churches are predominantly wood. I'm trying to think what the floor was made of the ones I think that was predominantly wood. And they have the wood is treated. I think it's pitch. So you've got that creosote type smell, which is really has that tension, that real tension with it, where you're like, I don't know if I like that. It's a bit much, but actually when you catch it on the breeze or you're a little bit away from it, or as is the case with the stave churches, it's been very seasoned. And and you get that that kind of creosote smell overlaying a very sort of sweet wood, seasoned wood. It's not new wood, it's old wood. And then the particular church I'm thinking of is by the fjord. So there's a that water, that kind of that fresh air, fresh water smell mixed in with the memory of it. And then there are the trapping, there are the sort of incense whispers, candle wax whispers, and more wood in the church, which is less heavily treated with the pitch and the tar. And there's a sweetness to it, as well as this kind of creosote smell. I think it's friendlier and warmer and more comforting than a stone church, which I think, like they can smell a little bit austere, I do really like church smells actually. But yeah, there's something very specific about a Norwegian stave church, and I find it really compelling, and it's got a very strong scent association in my mind. And when I smell something that is even in that wheelhouse, I kind of get a really strong mental picture of it. And very multifaceted, very interesting. And I think that would wear really well as a perfume, particularly if you could, weave in the different elements like the weather and the setting and that sort of thing. I think it would work really well. Maybe a little bit too specific.
Well, now you've sold me on going to Norway for certain. No, it sounds like an incredibly complex smell, but not one that should be out of reach of a skilled perfumer. So I think this is a fascinating set of smells that we've discussed today, and I'm kind of curious to know, not only for anybody's suggestions, if they happen to know a scent that nails any of these things, or at least comes close to doing so, but I'm kind of curious to know what our audience, our viewers and readers on Fragrantica know that they want to smell in a scent that they've smelled outside of the world of fragrance. And I'm sure we're going to run into some really interesting responses there. So certainly share those in the comments below, and we're really going to be reading these and hopefully, making some suggestions if we know of any that might match your need there.
Absolutely. Yeah, please do.